John Denver was standing at the back of a small white church in Tennessee, guitar case still in hand, when Glen Campbell leaned over and told him there was someone in that congregation he needed to hear. What John sang next, and what happened when an old woman in the third pew finally opened her mouth to answer him, left the whole room speechless. If stories like this keep John Denver's music alive in your heart, take a moment to subscribe, because what happened in that little church deserves to be remembered. Now, back to that Sunday morning in Tennessee. It was the 14th of November, 1976, and John had a rare open Sunday between tour stops, a single quiet morning tucked between a Friday night show in Knoxville and a Monday afternoon sound check 2 states away. Glen Campbell had been playing a run of dates nearby that same week, and the two men had crossed paths often enough over the years, at award shows and benefit concerts and the occasional late night after a mutual friend session, that a real and easy respect had grown up between them, the kind two working musicians build slowly, through shared stages rather than grand declarations. When Glen called John's hotel room that Saturday evening and asked if he might come sit in the congregation for the early service at a little church outside town the next morning, John did not hesitate for a moment. The church itself was a modest white frame building with a simple steeple, the kind of country chapel that had likely stood in that same spot for the better part of a century, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of Sunday mornings. Glen had been coming to that particular congregation for years whenever his touring schedule allowed, drawn by memories of the small Church of Christ services of his own Arkansas childhood, and he had grown close with the pastor and several of the older families who filled the front rows without fail every week. John arrived a few minutes before the service began, dressed plainly, his guitar case tucked under one arm out of habit more than plan, and slipped quietly into a back pew beside Glen. Sunlight came through plain glass windows rather than stained ones, falling in long, honest bars across the wooden floor, and a small upright piano stood off to one side of the choir loft, its bench worn pale at the center from decades of the same faithful hands. The congregation that morning was mostly older families, farmers and shopkeepers and their wives, a scattering of grandchildren fidgeting quietly in their good Sunday clothes, the whole room carrying the particular warmth of a place where everyone had known everyone else's business and everyone else's sorrows for most of their lives. But what none of the 60 or so people gathered in those pews that morning knew was that among them sat a woman named Vera Coates, 71 years old, who had sung in that church's small choir for nearly 40 years before a slow illness had thinned her voice down to almost nothing over the past 2 winters. Vera still came every Sunday, still sat in the same third pew on the left where she had sat since she was a young bride, but she had stopped singing a long months ago, moving her lips through the hymns out of habit while barely any sound came out at all. She kept a hymnal on her lap out of old reflex, its cover cracked and its pages soft from decades of handling, though these days she mostly just held it and listened. Vera had joined that choir at 19, standing in the back row beside her own mother, who had sung alto in that same loft for 30 years before her. She had a voice once, a genuinely fine one, clear and steady enough that the choir director used to place her near the front whenever a solo verse needed carrying. And there had been a stretch of years, back when her children were small and her husband still worked the feed store on the corner of Main Street, when Sunday mornings in that choir loft had been the brightest hour of her whole week. She had sung at weddings and funerals alike for half the families in that congregation, her voice a steady thread running through nearly every major moment the small community had marked together. The illness had come on slowly, almost gently at first, a persistent cough that would not clear, then a thinning in her breath that made the high notes impossible, and eventually made even the low ones a struggle. The doctor in town had explained it plainly enough, something to do with her lungs weakening with age, nothing dramatic or sudden, just a slow closing of a door that had once stood wide open. Vera had grieved that loss quietly, the way she grieved most things, without complaint, simply moving her seat from the choir loft down to the third pew, and telling herself it was only right to let younger voices carry the songs now. What Glen knew, and what he had quietly mentioned to John the night before on the telephone, was that Vera's late husband had been a great admirer of John's music, and that in the final year of his life, as his own health failed, The two of them used to sit together on their back porch some evenings with an old radio, playing his records low into the twilight. Vera had continued that small ritual alone after he passed, keeping his records in a cabinet by the record player and putting one on some nights when the house felt too quiet to bear. Glen had learned this from the pastor's wife only a few weeks earlier, almost in passing, and something about it had stayed with him ever since, the way small true things sometimes do. Vera's husband had been a quiet man named Curtis, a feed store owner who never sang a note himself, but who loved to listen, tapping his boot heel against the porch boards while John's records turned on the old console radio he had bought secondhand years before. In his last winter, when the walking grew hard and the evenings grew long, those records had become almost a ritual between them. Curtis in his chair with a blanket over his knees, and Vera beside him, her hand resting on his, the porch light drawing moths, while a familiar voice filled the quiet Tennessee dark. He had passed in the early spring of that same year, and Vera had kept the ritual going alone every so often since, though the house felt considerably emptier for it. John understood something of that particular kind of quiet grief without needing it explained to him twice. He had spent his own childhood being uprooted again and again as an Air Force officer's son, learning early how music could become the one steady companion in an otherwise shifting life, the thing that stayed the same when everything else did not. He knew what it meant for a person to hold onto a record or a hymn the way some people hold onto a photograph, something worn thin by returning to it too many times to count. And as Glen quietly pointed Vera out across the aisle before the service began, John found himself watching her without meaning to, the careful way she held that worn hymnal, the way her eyes stayed fixed somewhere just past the choir loft, somewhere that seemed to belong to a memory rather than the room in front of her. The service moved through its familiar rhythms, opening prayer, a reading from Scripture, and then the moment when the small choir rose to lead the first hymn of the morning. John watched Vera's lips move along with the words of Amazing Grace, her hands folded tightly over that old hymnal, no real sound coming from her at all, and he felt something tighten quietly in his own chest, an ache of recognition for a kind of silence he understood better than most people might guess. When the hymn ended and the pastor rose to introduce the morning's guests, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that 2 visiting musicians had joined the congregation that day. A soft ripple of recognition moved through the pews as people realized who was sitting quietly among them. Glen stood first, offering a brief, humble word of thanks for the welcome and a short remark about how grateful he always was to worship simply, away from any stage, and then, with a gentle nod toward the back pew, he mentioned that his friend John Denver had come along with him that morning and might be willing to share a song if the congregation would have him. John rose slowly, guitar case already open at his feet from where he had set it down earlier, and made his way to the small space at the front of the church, near the choir loft rather than any raised platform. He looked out over the 60 faces gathered there, ordinary faces, work-worn hands folded in laps, and his eyes found Vera's again, still fixed and distant in the third pew. "Absolutely," John said quietly, settling his guitar across his knee. "I'd be honored." He began with Sunshine on My Shoulders, his voice soft and unhurried in a way it rarely was on the big stages he usually filled, better suited to the close wooden walls of that little sanctuary than any arena. The small congregation listened in complete stillness, and by the second verse, several of the older women had begun humming quietly along under their breath, the melody simple enough to carry even for those who had never heard it before that morning. As John reached the final chorus, he did something none of the 60 people in that church expected. He let his voice drop nearly to nothing, strumming the chords gently, and looked directly toward the third pew. He said, gently and without any trace of performance in his voice, that he understood some songs are easier to hold on to quietly than to sing out loud, and that there was no shame at all in that. He said he had heard from a good friend that there was a woman in the church that morning whose husband had loved music the way some men love the land they were raised on, and that if she felt so moved, he would be glad to have her voice join his, even just a little, on the very last line. The church went completely still, the particular hush that settles over a small room when everyone senses something true and fragile is unfolding right in front of them. Vera's hands tightened around her hymnal, and for a long moment nobody was certain she would move at all. Then, slowly, her lips began to shape the words along with John's guitar, and though at first almost nothing came out, something in her seemed to steady, the way a person steadies themselves against a railing before taking a difficult step. By the final line, a thin, trembling thread of sound finally broke free from her, barely more than a whisper, the first real note she had sung aloud in nearly 2 years. John slowed his playing further still, giving her voice room to exist in the silence around it, and when that last note faded, the whole church seemed to hold its breath together. Vera lowered her hymnal, tears sliding freely down her weathered face, and John crossed the small space between them, kneeling beside her pew, the way a man kneels beside someone he has decided, in that moment, matters more than anything else happening around him. "What's your name?" he asked gently, and she had to try twice before the words came out steady. "Vera," she finally managed. "Vera Coates. I haven't sung out loud, not really. Not since my husband passed. My voice it left me somehow, along with him." John reached out and took her weathered hand in both of his. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Vera," he said quietly. "But I want you to know something. That voice of yours didn't leave you. It's been right there this whole time. It just needed the room to feel safe enough to come out again." He glanced briefly toward the choir loft, then back to her. "Your husband loved these songs. Sounds to me like he'd be awful proud to know you still remember every word." Vera's shoulders shook with quiet, unguarded tears, and several of the women seated nearby reached across the pew to rest gentle hands on her back. A member of the choir who had known Vera for decades later said she had never once in all those years seen her cry in front of the congregation, not even at her husband's funeral, where she had sat dry-eyed and composed through the entire service, holding everyone else together instead. But here's the part of that morning nobody in that little church saw coming. John did not simply return to his pew once Vera had gathered herself. Instead, he asked the choir director, a soft-spoken man who had led that small group for over a decade, whether Vera might join him for just one more verse, right there, together. The choir director glanced at Vera, who nodded through her tears, and the small congregation waited in tender silence as John helped her to her feet. Together they worked through the closing verse a second time, John's steady voice wrapped gently around Vera's thin, uncertain one, never once overpowering her, only holding space beside her the way a hand rests lightly under someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Her voice grew stronger with each line, still fragile, still catching here and there, but undeniably present, filling that small sanctuary in a way it had not in nearly 2 years. An elderly deacon seated near the front later said he watched grown men in that congregation wipe their eyes without any embarrassment at all. A young mother, 2 pews back, lifted her small daughter onto her lap so the girl could see over the seats ahead of them, whispering that this was something worth remembering. Glen Campbell, still seated quietly in the back pew, later told the pastor's wife it was one of the most genuine moments of worship he had witnessed in all his years of touring, quieter and truer than any arena crowd he had ever sung for. Near the front, the choir director stood with both hands pressed to his chest, watching a voice he had trained and cherished for decades find its way back into the room he had built for it. A row of older women who had sung beside Vera for years reached across the pew backs to touch her shoulder, one after another, a quiet chain of hands passing something warmer than words could carry. Even the youngest children in the congregation, too small to understand exactly what was happening, seemed to sense the weight of it going still and wide-eyed in their parents' laps. When the final note faded, the small church did not erupt into applause the way an auditorium might have. Instead, a soft, reverent murmur of amens moved through the pews, and several people rose without being asked and embraced whoever sat nearest them. Vera stood holding her old hymnal against her chest with both hands, her face wet but her shoulders somehow lighter than they had looked all morning. In the weeks that followed, the pastor's wife wrote to a cousin in another state that Vera had begun humming again around the church, softly at first, then with more confidence each Sunday, and that she had rejoined the choir's back row before the season turned. A neighbor who lived near Vera recalled that she started keeping her husband's old records playing a little louder in the evenings, no longer quite so careful to keep the volume low enough that nobody outside might hear. The choir director, in his own quiet way, began setting aside a single verse in nearly every hymn for Vera to lead alone. Nothing showy, just a few lines here and there, where her voice, still thin but steadily gaining strength, could carry the melody the way it once had years before. He later told the pastor that he had never seen a voice come back quite like that, slowly but surely, the way a garden comes back after a hard winter, not all at once but faithfully, one green shoot at a time. By the following spring, Vera was singing full hymns again most Sundays, her voice never quite what it had been in her younger years, but present, warm, and unmistakably hers. She kept that old hymnal on her lap every week after that morning, the same cracked cover and soft pages, but she began writing small notes in its margins again, something she had not done since before her illness took hold, little reminders of verses she wanted to remember, dates of Sundays that had mattered. A granddaughter who visited that following Christmas later said her grandmother seemed lighter somehow, quicker to laugh, humming while she worked in the kitchen in a way she had not done in years. The story of that quiet Sunday morning traveled slowly through that small Tennessee community for years afterward, shared at church suppers and repeated by families who had been sitting in those pews and never forgot what they witnessed. It became, for many of them, a gentle reminder that grief can silence a person's voice without ever touching what lies beneath it, and that sometimes all it takes to bring that voice back is someone patient enough to make room for it. Members of that small congregation still spoke of it decades later, as the Sunday the music came back to Vera Coates, a quiet piece of the church's own history passed down alongside baptisms and weddings and harvest suppers. John Denver could have simply enjoyed a quiet Sunday away from the stage, sung his one requested song, and slipped back into the tour bus without ever noticing the woman in the third pew. Instead, he chose to kneel down beside a stranger's grief and help her find something she believed she had lost forever. We never really know what small, ordinary Sunday might hold the exact moment someone needs permission to sing again. If this story of a borrowed hymn and a voice finding its way home moved you tonight, we would be so grateful if you hit subscribe and give this video a like, and please share it with someone who has ever gone quiet after losing someone they loved. Do you remember a hymn or a song that carried you through a hard season of your own life? Tell us in the comments below and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next story from the heart of a true American legend.